On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. At that moment, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. It was the most powerful empire in human history. Just 6 years later, that empire would begin its irreversible collapse. But it wasn't the Nazis who delivered the fatal blow. The nation that stood beside Britain as its greatest ally would also become the architect of its financial ruin. This is the story of how World War II didn't just defeat fascism, it dismantled the British Empire $1 at a time. And it all began with a deal that sounded too good to be true. By 1940, Britain stood alone against Hitler's war machine. France had fallen, Europe was conquered. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced an impossible choice: surrender or bankrupt his nation to buy American weapons. Churchill chose survival. But survival came with a price tag that would echo for generations. This is the untold story of Lend-Lease, the agreement that saved Britain from Nazi invasion but cost them an empire. It is December 7th, 1940. Winston Churchill sat in his study at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Outside, the winter wind howled. Inside, the weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. It had already been a brutal year of financial humiliation. Back in September, Churchill had been forced to accept what became known as the Destroyers for Bases deal. Basically, Britain had to trade 50 aging American warships in exchange for 99-year leases on British military bases across the Caribbean and Newfoundland. Think about that. Britain, the world's greatest naval power, had to lease out sovereign territory just to get 50 rust bucket destroyer ships that were so old they'd been decommissioned. Some of these ships were from World War I. They were literally older than some of the sailors who'd crew them. Since 1939, American law required that any nation buying American weapons had to pay cash up front and transport the goods on their own ships. No credit, no American vessels. You want our weapons? Bring your checkbook, your gold, and your own boats. We will not do a doorstep delivery for you. Britain had complied, spending money it didn't have, risking ships it couldn't afford to lose to German U-boats. By late 1940, the British Treasury was scraping the bottom of the barrel, and American officials knew it. He'd been Prime Minister for only 7 months, but he'd aged years. The bags under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights spent in war rooms, watching red pins advance across maps of Europe. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his pen. Not from fear, he told himself, but from exhaustion. Churchill was a proud man. Pride coursed through his veins like the brandy he consumed in alarming quantities. He was the descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, a man who believed Britain's greatness was written in the stars, destined by Providence itself. And now, he had to beg. The letter he was about to write would go to President Franklin Roosevelt, a man Churchill both admired and, if he was honest with himself, slightly resented. Roosevelt had everything Churchill needed: money, weapons, ships, aircraft. America's factories hummed with productive capacity while Britain's treasury was, to put it delicately, completely empty. Actually, let's be less delicate. Britain was broke. Spectacularly, catastrophically broke. Churchill began writing. Each word felt like swallowing glass. "The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies," he wrote, his characteristic eloquence barely masking the desperation beneath. In his mind, Churchill could see the faces of the Treasury officials who delivered the news weeks earlier. Sir Frederick Phillips, the Treasury representative in Washington, had been particularly grim. "Prime Minister," he'd said, "by March, we'll have exhausted every dollar, every ounce of gold, every asset we can liquidate. After that," he'd trailed off, but the implication was clear. After that, Britain would have to stop fighting. Not because they lacked the will, but because modern warfare runs on money, and Britain's bank account was about to hit zero. Churchill continued writing to Roosevelt, "If, as I believe, you are convinced that the defeat of the Nazi and fascist tyranny is a matter of high consequence to the people of the United States, you will regard this letter not as an appeal for aid, but as a statement of the minimum action necessary to achieve our common purpose." Read that again. Not as an appeal for aid. Churchill was literally begging for money while simultaneously insisting he wasn't begging. It's the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "I'm not angry," while slamming doors. The cognitive dissonance must have been excruciating for a man of his pride. But here's what was really eating at Churchill as he wrote. He knew Roosevelt had him cornered. The Americans knew Britain was desperate. They had accountants who could count just as well as British accountants, arguably better, since American accountants weren't distracted by German fireballs falling on their heads. Churchill sealed the letter and sent it across the Atlantic. Then he waited. And drank. Quite a lot, actually. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received Churchill's letter while vacationing on the USS Tuscaloosa in the Caribbean. Because apparently, even during world wars, presidents need beach time. They are human. Roosevelt read the letter twice, then leaned back in his chair, a cigarette holder clenched between his teeth at that familiar cocky angle. His mind was racing, but his face showed nothing, a skill he'd perfected from years of hiding his polio from a public that demanded their leaders look strong. FDR had a problem. Actually, he had several problems. But let's focus on the big one. He wanted to help Britain, but American law explicitly forbade it. There was something called the Neutrality Acts, passed in the isolationist fever of the 1930s, which made it illegal to lend money or sell weapons to nations at war. Americans remembered World War I, the pointless slaughter, the unpaid debts, the sense that they'd been suckered into a European conflict that had nothing to do with them. Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was particularly emphatic about this. Morgenthau was a nervous man who worried constantly about public opinion, congressional backlash, and whether history would judge them harshly. "Mr. President," he'd said during one heated cabinet meeting, "if we openly violate the Neutrality Acts, Congress will have your head, and mine, probably on consecutive days." But Roosevelt was nothing if not creative. Some might say deviously clever, others might say willing to bend rules until they screamed for mercy. He called in his advisors. "Gentlemen," he said, smoke curling from his cigarette, "we need to help Britain without technically helping Britain. We need to give them weapons without giving them weapons. We need to lend them money without lending them money." His advisors stared at him. "I don't follow, Mr. President," said Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Roosevelt smiled, that famous smile euro, the one that made you feel like he was sharing a wonderful secret. "Suppose my neighbor's house is on fire," he said, warming to his metaphor, "and I have a garden hose. I don't say to him, 'Neighbor, my hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' No. I say, 'Neighbor, take my hose and put out the fire, and when you're done, give it back to me.'" There was a long pause. "Sir," Morgenthau said carefully, "garden hoses don't explode when you use them. We're talking about lending them destroyers and fighter planes and tanks. They're not getting those back in one piece." Roosevelt waved his hand dismissively. "Details, Henry, details." But behind Roosevelt's breezy confidence lay a cold calculation. He knew what Churchill didn't want to admit. Britain was finished as a superpower regardless of who won the war. If Germany won, obviously, Britain would be conquered. But even if Britain won, it would emerge so financially devastated that its empire would crumble. This was America's chance. The torch of global leadership was being passed, whether Churchill wanted to pass it or not. Roosevelt just had to make sure he grabbed it without looking too eager. Some historians call this pragmatic alliance building. Others call it opportunistic vulture capitalism. Roosevelt would probably have called it making the best of a bad situation. Tell me, what would you call it? On December 17, 1940, Roosevelt held a press conference and unveiled his plan, Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease Act sounded wonderful in principle. America would lend or lease weapons and supplies to any nation whose defense was vital to American security. These nations wouldn't have to pay cash up front, they'd settle accounts after the war. Roosevelt sold it to the American public as the neighborly thing to do. He sold it to Congress as a way to keep America out of the war while ensuring Germany lost. He even gave it a patriotic bill number, H.R. 1776. Subtle, Franklin. Real subtle. But here's what Roosevelt didn't advertise. The terms of Lend-Lease were about to fleece Britain more thoroughly than a shepherd on shearing day. Back in London, Churchill received news of the Lend-Lease proposal with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because it meant Britain could keep fighting. Dread, because he absolutely knew, this would come with strings attached. He was right. Before Lend-Lease could begin, American negotiators descended on London like accountants at an estate sale. They had clipboards, they had demands, and they had the unmistakable confidence of people who held all the cards. Leading the American delegation was W. Averell Harriman, a railroad heir turned diplomat who wore expensive suits and an expression that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Harriman's job was simple: extract maximum concessions from Britain while they were too desperate to refuse. Across the table sat Sir Frederick Phillips and John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist. Keynes was brilliant, caustic, and utterly furious at the position Britain found itself in. His letters from this period drip with barely contained rage. I paraphrase, "The Americans are determined to strip us of everything we possess before they will give us even a moment's aid. They wish to reduce us to a state of total dependency." The first American demand, Britain had to prove it was actually broke. Not "we're running low on funds" broke, not "we're being careful with our budget" broke. Completely, utterly, "we've sold everything, including the family silver" broke. And they meant everything. In December 1940, even before Lend-Lease was finalized, Britain had already begun shipping gold across the Atlantic. Not just some gold, nearly half of Britain's entire gold reserves. Between October 1939 and August 1940, HMS Emerald made multiple voyages carrying a staggering 58 million pounds in gold bullion. That's about $232 million in 1940 dollars, or roughly $4.8 billion today. Her sister ship, HMS Enterprise, carried another 10 million pounds. That would be all. Oh no, my friend, that wasn't enough. America wanted more proof of British desperation. Part of the larger Operation Fish, Britain shipped a total of $2.5 billion worth of gold and securities to Canada, literally the largest movement of physical wealth in history. British cruisers made regular runs across waters infested by German U-boats, their holds stuffed with gold bars that represented centuries of accumulated national wealth. Each shipment was a humiliation. Britain literally shipped its treasure across the Atlantic like tribute payments to an empire. "We're being treated like a defeated nation," one British naval officer wrote in his diary, "except we haven't lost the war yet." So British officials opened their books completely. American accountants crawled through every asset Britain owned, every investment, every holding across the globe. They found gold reserves. Americans demanded they be shipped immediately. They found investments in American companies. Americans demanded they be liquidated at fire sale prices. They found anything of value anywhere in the world. Americans wanted it sold, now, even if it meant taking massive losses. Keynes wrote, "Britain was being treated worse than we have ever ourselves thought it proper to treat the humblest and least responsible Balkan country." Coming from a man who'd helped dictate terms to defeated nations after World War I, that assessment carried weight. The message was clear. Britain wasn't being treated as an ally in distress. It was being treated as a debtor to be squeezed dry. One particularly galling example stands out like a sore thumb: the American Viscose Corporation. Now, you might be thinking, what is this viscose? Fair question. Viscose is a type of rayon, a synthetic fabric that was absolutely crucial during wartime. It was used for everything: parachutes, tire cords, uniforms, even surgical dressings. In the 1940s, viscose was as strategically important as oil or steel, and Britain owned the crown jewel of viscose production. The American Viscose Corporation wasn't just any company. It was the largest rayon manufacturer in the United States, controlling roughly 50% of the American market. Britain's Courtaulds Textile Company had founded it back in 1910 and built it into an industrial powerhouse. By 1940, it employed over 10,000 workers across multiple states and generated enormous profits. British Treasury officials valued this controlling stake at £120 million. That's roughly $484 million in 1940 dollars, or about $11.2 billion in today's money. This wasn't some speculative number pulled from thin air. This was based on the company's assets, market position, and profit history. It was one of Britain's most valuable overseas investments, and Britain desperately didn't want to sell it. Sir Frederick Phillips argued passionately with American negotiators. "This asset generates consistent revenue," he explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "It pays dividends that help fund our war effort. If we retain it, it continues producing income for years. Why would we sell a golden goose?" The Americans were unmoved. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, was blunt. "You claim you're broke, but you're sitting on $500 million in American assets. Sell them. Prove you actually need Lend-Lease." "But the market is depressed," Phillips protested. "If we're forced to sell during wartime, we'll take massive losses. Any buyer will know we're desperate. They'll lowball us mercilessly." Morgenthau shrugged. "That sounds like a you problem, Sir Frederick." The subtext was clear. America wanted Britain's assets sold off, even at fire sale prices, to ensure Britain was truly, completely, humiliatingly broke before Lend-Lease began. It wasn't enough for Britain to be struggling, they had to be stripped bare. John Maynard Keynes, reviewing the American demands from London, wrote a scathing memo. "They are insisting we liquidate our most profitable investments at the worst possible moment, ensuring maximum loss. This isn't negotiation, it's asset stripping." But Britain had no choice. In March 1941, American Viscose Corporation was sold to a syndicate of American investment bankers led by Morgan Stanley for $54 million. Let me repeat that number. $54 million. The company's assets alone, just its cash, securities, and physical property, were worth $128 million. Industry experts estimated the entire company was worth between $100 and $150 million. Britain received $54 million for a company worth at minimum $128 million. That's a loss of $74 million in 1941 money, or about $1.7 billion in today's money, on a single forced sale. And here's the real kick in the teeth. Those American bankers who bought it for $54 million, they turned around and resold it to public investors just months later for $62 million. They made an $8 million profit in less than 6 months. Britain lost billions. The company didn't suddenly become worthless. It didn't collapse. In fact, American Viscose Corporation continued to be wildly profitable throughout the 1940s and beyond. But Britain needed the money, you might say. Sure. Except here's the twisted part. America used Lend-Lease to provide aid that Britain would have to pay back anyway. So Britain sold assets at catastrophic losses to raise immediate cash, then received aid that created long-term debt. It's the financial equivalent of forcing someone to pawn their wedding ring for $100, then lending them $500 at interest. They end up poorer on both ends of the transaction. And American Viscose was just one example. Britain was forced to liquidate investments in American companies across multiple industries, losing billions in the process, while American negotiators watched with clipboards and calculating expressions. Courtaulds, another British firm, sold its American holdings. British tobacco companies sold their American operations. British-owned utilities, real estate, stocks, bonds, all of it dumped onto the market at whatever price buyers would pay. And buyers, of course, knowing Britain was desperate, paid as little as possible. One British Treasury official later estimated that Britain lost approximately 40% of its total overseas investments during this period, not through military defeat, but through forced liquidation to satisfy America's demands for proof of poverty. But what choice did Britain have? Refuse and face Germany alone? Churchill couldn't do it, so he swallowed his pride again and accepted the terms. Lend-Lease officially began in March 1941. American weapons, food, and supplies started flowing across the Atlantic. On paper, it was a lifeline. In reality, it was a leash. Here's what most people don't realize about Lend-Lease. It came with conditions that systematically dismantled British economic independence. Condition 1. Britain couldn't use Lend-Lease materials for exports that competed with American products. Think about that for a moment. Britain received American raw materials, components, and machinery under Lend-Lease. But if British manufacturers wanted to use those materials to make products for export, to earn desperately needed foreign currency, they needed permission. And that permission was often denied if the exports might compete with American businesses. Britain had factories, workers, and expertise. But American negotiators inserted clauses that prevented Britain from using Lend-Lease aid to rebuild its export economy. British goods made with American materials couldn't enter commercial channels or be re-exported. So while Britain desperately needed to earn foreign currency through exports to pay its debts, Lend-Lease restrictions made it significantly harder to do so. British manufacturers had to prove their products contained no Lend-Lease materials before they could export, a bureaucratic nightmare that strangled British industry. "We're being deliberately handicapped," one industrialist complained to the Board of Trade. "We can't rebuild our export trade while tied to these restrictions." Condition 2. Britain had to eliminate imperial preference. This was the big one. You see, for decades, Britain had maintained imperial preference, a system where Britain and its colonies traded with each other on favorable terms, keeping outsiders at a disadvantage. It was, in truth, protectionist, yes, but it was also the economic glue holding the empire together. American negotiators demanded it end. Article 7 of the Master Lend-Lease Agreement committed Britain to work toward the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. Translation: American companies wanted access to British colonial markets on equal terms. Churchill resisted this one harder than anything else. The empire was his sacred cause. He'd once declared, "I have not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." American negotiators were unmoved. "Mr. Prime Minister," Harriman said during one heated exchange, "you can have Lend-Lease or you can have imperial preference. You cannot have both." Churchill's choice: economic sovereignty or survival. He chose survival. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt in August 1941, committed Britain to access on equal terms to the trade and raw materials of the world. It seemed very noble, free trade for all. But what it actually meant was that American companies could now compete directly in British colonial markets. Free trade. Churchill knew what he'd done. In signing the Atlantic Charter with its commitment to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce, he'd agreed to dismantle imperial preference, the economic foundation of the empire. He tried to spin it publicly. In Parliament, Churchill argued the charter was meant only for occupied nations, not British colonies. But the Americans weren't fooled, and neither was Churchill. The empire's economic protection was gone. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Britain had received roughly $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, about $433 billion in today's money. Roosevelt had promised the repayment terms would be generous, and technically, they were compared to loan sharks. In 1945, with the war over, President Truman, the new president after Roosevelt had died in April, called in the debt. Actually, called in makes it sound gradual. Truman terminated Lend-Lease literally within days of Japan's surrender. British officials were stunned. "We thought we'd have time to rebuild. We thought they'd show some mercy." They thought wrong. America demanded payment. Not immediate full payment. They weren't monsters, but payment on terms that would cripple Britain's recovery. John Maynard Keynes, now 62 and in failing health, was sent to Washington in September 1945 to negotiate the final terms. He arrived hoping for a grant or, at minimum, an interest-free loan. He believed Britain's sacrifice in standing alone against Hitler for a year deserved some consideration. Some applaud. What he got instead was a masterclass in hardball negotiation. America opened with a demand for immediate repayment of all outstanding Lend-Lease accounts. Keynes nearly fainted. He explained patiently at first, then with increasing desperation, that Britain's economy was destroyed. Its cities were rubble. Its people were starving. Rationing was actually getting worse after the war than during it. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, Treasury Secretary, and William Clayton, Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, were unmoved. Britain must accept commercial realities, they said. Commercial realities? Keynes reportedly snapped back. We fought for our survival and yours while you profited. We bled for civilization while you counted your dollars. The negotiations dragged on for months. Keynes was exhausted, suffering from heart problems, and emotionally shattered by the harsh treatment he encountered. His frustration with American demands was palpable in his correspondence during this period. The final settlement, reached in December 1945, consisted of two parts. First, the Lend-Lease settlement. Britain had received roughly $20 billion more in Lend-Lease aid than it had provided in return. America agreed to write off this massive debt in exchange for a payment of $650 million, but only for goods still in transit or not consumed during the war. This was actually generous compared to the full amount owed. Second, the Anglo-American loan. To keep Britain's economy afloat after the war, America extended a new line of credit of $3.75 billion, about $60 billion in today's money, at 2% interest, to be repaid over 50 years starting in 1950. Only 2%, American newspapers crowed. What generosity! But here's the context. Britain's economy was destroyed. Its cities were rubble. It was still rationing food. In fact, British rationing got worse after the war than during it. And now Britain had to make annual payments to America while simultaneously trying to rebuild. The stress was destroying Keynes physically. Within weeks of returning to Britain in April 1946, he suffered a fatal heart attack. Some historians say the stress of these negotiations killed him. That might be melodramatic, or it might be exactly right. That could not be verified. Britain made its final payment on the Lend-Lease debt in December 2006. Yes, you read that correctly. 2006. Britain spent 61 years paying back the debt from World War II. Generations of British taxpayers, people who weren't even born when Churchill wrote that desperate letter, paid for weapons used to defeat Hitler. But the real cost of Lend-Lease wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in power. The conditions attached to Lend-Lease shattered the economic foundations of the British Empire. Without imperial preference, the colonies had no special reason to remain connected to Britain. Why maintain loyalty to London when you could trade freely with wealthier America? India gained independence in 1947, Burma in 1948. Other African countries followed. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the empire unraveled colony by colony. Some of this was inevitable. Nationalist movements were rising regardless. But Lend-Lease accelerated the process by decades. Britain simply couldn't afford to maintain an empire while servicing its American debts. Meanwhile, back home, America's economy boomed. The war that devastated Europe left American factories untouched and American industries dominant. The dollar replaced the pound quickly as the world's reserve currency. American military bases spread across the globe, including, ironically, on British territory. The torch had been passed. America was the new superpower. Britain was an ally, a junior partner, a savior nation that had saved the world from fascism and bankrupted itself in the process. Churchill lived long enough to see all of this unfold. He served as prime minister again from 1951 to 1955, but it was a shadow of his wartime role. Britain was a shadow of its former self. In his final years, Churchill grew increasingly melancholic about what had been lost. We have won the war, but perhaps we have lost the peace. He never quite forgave Roosevelt, despite calling him a friend. He never forgot that moment when he had to beg for help and found his ally waiting with an invoice. So here's the uncomfortable truth about World War II that doesn't fit neatly into heroic narratives or in our history textbooks. Yes, on record and in the news, Britain and America were allies. Yes, they fought together against genuine evil. Yes, America's support was crucial to defeating fascism. But it's also true that America used Britain's desperation to extract enormous economic and political concessions. Lend-Lease wasn't charity. It was the most profitable business deal in history, one that transferred global dominance from Britain to America. Was this wrong or right? That's complicated. American negotiators would argue they were simply protecting American interests. They'd say Britain would have done the same in the reverse scenario. Well, if we're honest, you cannot argue with them on that one. They'd also point out that America eventually entered the war and paid in American blood too. You cannot dispute that either. But British historians tend to see it differently. They see an ally that waited until Britain was on its knees before helping, then charged premium prices for that help. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Lend-Lease saved Britain from Nazi conquest, that's not debatable. But it also ensured that Britain emerged from the war as a spent force, its empire crumbling, its economy shattered, its global dominance transferred across the Atlantic. Churchill understood this, even as he signed the papers. He made a deal he hated because the alternative was unthinkable. He saved Britain from Hitler but couldn't save Britain from history. The empire's price was paid in full. I'm Malcolm, and this is where history meets economics. Subscribe now, because the history we don't see is the history that shapes us. And sometimes, the bills from saving the world take 60 years to pay off. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment where history met economics.